The rooster's crow cut through the cool morning air like a rusty knife. Rebecca pulled her worn boots on and stepped out onto the wooden porch of the old ranch house. The sun was just starting to peek over the distant mountains, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and orange. She loved this time of day when everything felt peaceful and the world belonged to her alone. The ranch had been in her family for 3 generations. Her grandfather built this house with his own hands back in 1952, using timber from the hills behind the property. Every board creaked with history, and every room held memories of the people who came before her. When Grandpa Joe passed away 2 years ago, everyone expected her to sell the place and move to town. But Rebecca couldn't bring herself to let go of the land that shaped her childhood. She walked across the dusty yard toward the chicken coop, her boots crunching on the gravel. The hens were already making noise, demanding their breakfast. As she scattered feet across the ground, she noticed how quiet everything seemed today. Usually, she could hear cattle moving in the distance or the sound of her husband's truck rumbling somewhere on the property. But this morning felt different somehow. Tom had left before sunrise to check on the herd in the far pasture. The spring calving season was almost over, but they still had a few cows that needed watching. He planned to ride the fence line too, looking for any breaks that might let the cattle wander onto the neighbor's land. It was hard work, but Tom never complained. He understood what this place meant to her. After feeding the chickens, Rebecca made her way to the barn. The old building smelled like hay and leather, familiar scents that always made her feel at home. She grabbed a bucket and headed to the milk cow's stall. Bessie was waiting patiently, her large brown eyes watching Rebecca's every move while she milked. Rebecca's mind wandered to the conversation she'd had with Mrs. Peterson at the general store yesterday. The older woman had been full of gossip about strange men asking questions around town. According to her, 3 outsiders had been hanging around for almost a week, claiming to be interested in the local history. They'd been asking about old mines and abandoned claims, particularly about properties that had been in families for generations. Rebecca hadn't thought much about it at the time. Treasure hunters and amateur historians showed up now and then, usually chasing stories about lost gold from the mining days. Most of them gave up after a few days when they realized how much work was involved in actually searching the rocky terrain, but something about Mrs. Peterson's description bothered her. The woman mentioned that these men seemed different from the usual curious visitors. They asked pointed questions about specific ranches and seemed to know details about property lines and ownership that most outsiders wouldn't bother learning. As Rebecca finished milking Bessie, she heard a sound that made her pause. It was the rumble of a vehicle coming up the long dirt road that led to the ranch. She glanced at her watch and frowned. Tom wouldn't be back for hours, and they weren't expecting any deliveries or visitors. She stepped out of the barn and shaded her eyes. Against the morning sun, a dusty pickup truck was making its way slowly up the road, raising a cloud of dirt behind it. The vehicle wasn't one she recognized, which was unusual in their small community where everyone knew everyone else's cars and trucks. Rebecca felt a small knot of unease form in her stomach. Living this far from town meant being careful about unexpected visitors. While most people in the area were friendly and helpful, the isolation also meant that help was far away if trouble came calling. She walked back toward the house, keeping one eye on the approaching truck. The vehicle stopped near the front gate, and she could see 3 men inside. They sat there for a moment, seeming to study the property before the driver's door opened. The man who got out was tall and thin, with dark hair and clothes that looked too clean for ranch work. He had the kind of pale skin that spoke of someone who spent most of his time indoors or in cities. As he walked toward the gate, Rebecca noticed he moved with purpose, like someone who had already decided what he wanted. The other 2 men stayed in the truck, but she could see them watching her through the windshield. Something about their presence made her instinctively step closer to the house, where Grandpa Joe's old rifle hung above the fireplace. The tall man stopped at the gate and called out in a voice that carried across the yard. His tone was friendly enough, but there was something underneath it that didn't sit right with her. Rebecca had grown up on this land, learning to read people the same way she read the weather or the behavior of animals. Her grandfather always said that survival in ranch country meant trusting your instincts, and right now, every instinct she had was telling her to be careful. She thought about Tom, probably miles away by now, focused on his work and unaware that strangers had come to the ranch. The nearest neighbor was over 3 miles down the valley, and the town was even farther. For all practical purposes, she was alone with whatever these men wanted. The peaceful morning that had started with such promise now felt charged with tension. Rebecca realized that whatever happened next would test everything her grandfather had taught her about protecting the land and herself. She took a deep breath and stepped off the porch, walking slowly toward the gate where the stranger waited. As she got closer, she could see his eyes more clearly. They were cold and calculating, studying her and the property with an intensity that made her skin crawl. This wasn't someone who had simply lost his way or needed directions to town. Behind him, she noticed that the other 2 men had gotten out of the truck and were positioning themselves on either side of the vehicle. The way they moved suggested they had done this before, approaching isolated properties with some kind of plan in mind. Rebecca stopped about 10 feet from the gate, close enough to talk but far enough to run if she needed to. She kept her voice steady and polite. Even though her heart was starting to beat faster, the man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He began to speak, and Rebecca knew immediately that her quiet morning was about to become something much more dangerous. Whatever these men wanted, it wasn't going to be as simple as asking for directions or requesting permission to search for old mining claims. The sun climbed higher in the sky, but the warmth couldn't chase away the chill that had settled over the ranch. Rebecca found herself thinking about her grandfather's stories of the old days, when people had to be ready to defend what was theirs against those who would take it by force. She had always thought those days were long past. But looking at the 3 strangers who had invaded her peaceful morning, she realized that some things never really changed. The strong still tried to take from the weak, and those who wanted to keep what was theirs had to be ready to fight for it. The rooster's crow cut through the cool morning air like a rusty knife. Rebecca pulled her worn boots on and stepped out onto the wooden porch of the old ranch house. The sun was just starting to peek over the distant mountains, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and orange. She loved this time of day when everything felt peaceful and the world belonged to her alone. The ranch had been in her family for 3 generations. Her grandfather built this house with his own hands back in 1952, using timber from the hills behind the property. Every board creaked with history, and every room held memories of the people who came before her. When Grandpa Joe passed away 2 years ago, everyone expected her to sell the place and move to town. But Rebecca couldn't bring herself to let go of the land that shaped her childhood. She walked across the dusty yard toward the chicken coop, her boots crunching on the gravel. The hens were already making noise, demanding their breakfast. As she scattered feet across the ground, she noticed how quiet everything seemed today. Usually, she could hear cattle moving in the distance or the sound of her husband's truck rumbling somewhere on the property. But this morning felt different somehow. Tom had left before sunrise to check on the herd in the far pasture. The spring calving season was almost over, but they still had a few cows that needed watching. He planned to ride the fence line, too, looking for any breaks that might let the cattle wander onto the neighbor's land. It was hard work, but Tom never complained. He understood what this place meant to her. After feeding the chickens, Rebecca made her way to the barn. The old building smelled like hay and leather, familiar scents that always made her feel at home. She grabbed a bucket and headed to the milk cow stall. Bessie was waiting patiently, her large brown eyes watching Rebecca's every move while she milked. Rebecca's mind wandered to the conversation she'd had with Mrs. Peterson at the general store yesterday. The older woman had been full of gossip about strange men asking questions around town. According to her, 3 outsiders had been hanging around for almost a week, claiming to be interested in the local history. They'd been asking about old mines and abandoned claims, particularly about properties that had been in families for generations. Rebecca hadn't thought much about it at the time. Treasure hunters and amateur historians showed up now and then, usually chasing stories about lost gold from the mining days. Most of them gave up after a few days when they realized how much work was involved in actually searching the rocky terrain, but something about Mrs. Peterson's description bothered her. The woman mentioned that these men seemed different from the usual curious visitors. They asked pointed questions about specific ranches and seemed to know details about property lines and ownership that most outsiders wouldn't bother learning. As Rebecca finished milking Bessie, she heard a sound that made her pause. It was the rumble of a vehicle coming up the long dirt road that led to the ranch. She glanced at her watch and frowned. Tom wouldn't be back for hours. And they weren't expecting any deliveries or visitors? She stepped out of the barn and shaded her eyes. Against the morning sun, a dusty pickup truck was making its way slowly up the road, raising a cloud of dirt behind it. The vehicle wasn't one she recognized, which was unusual in their small community where everyone knew everyone else's cars and trucks. Rebecca felt a small knot of unease form in her stomach. Living this far from town meant being careful about unexpected visitors. While most people in the area were friendly and helpful, the isolation also meant that help was far away if trouble came calling. She walked back toward the house, keeping one eye on the approaching truck. The vehicle stopped near the front gate, and she could see 3 men inside. They sat there for a moment, seeming to study the property before the driver's door opened. The man who got out was tall and thin, with dark hair and clothes that looked too clean for ranch work. He had the kind of pale skin that spoke of someone who spent most of his time indoors or in cities. As he walked toward the gate, Rebecca noticed he moved with purpose, like someone who had already decided what he wanted. The other 2 men stayed in the truck, but she could see them watching her through the windshield. Something about their presence made her instinctively step closer to the house, where Grandpa Joe's old rifle hung above the fireplace. The tall man stopped at the gate and called out in a voice that carried across the yard. His tone was friendly enough, but there was something underneath it that didn't sit right with her. Rebecca had grown up on this land, learning to read people the same way she read the weather or the behavior of animals. Her grandfather always said that survival in ranch country meant trusting your instincts. And right now, every instinct she had was telling her to be careful. She thought about Tom, probably miles away by now, focused on his work and unaware that strangers had come to the ranch. The nearest neighbor was over 3 miles down the valley, and the town was even farther. For all practical purposes, she was alone with whatever these men wanted. The peaceful morning that had started with such promise now felt charged with tension. Rebecca realized that whatever happened next would test everything her grandfather had taught her about protecting the land and herself. She took a deep breath and stepped off the porch, walking slowly toward the gate where the stranger waited. As she got closer, she could see his eyes more clearly. They were cold and calculating, studying her and the property with an intensity that made her skin crawl. This wasn't someone who had simply lost his way or needed directions to town. Behind him, she noticed that the other 2 men had gotten out of the truck and were positioning themselves on either side of the vehicle. The way they moved suggested they had done this before, approaching isolated properties with some kind of plan in mind. Rebecca stopped about 10 feet from the gate, close enough to talk but far enough to run if she needed to. She kept her voice steady and polite. Even though her heart was starting to beat faster, the man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He began to speak, and Rebecca knew immediately that her quiet morning was about to become something much more dangerous. Whatever these men wanted, it wasn't going to be as simple as asking for directions or requesting permission to search for old mining claims. The sun climbed higher in the sky, but the warmth couldn't chase away the chill that had settled over the ranch. Rebecca found herself thinking about her grandfather's stories of the old days, when people had to be ready to defend what was theirs against those who would take it by force. She had always thought those days were long past, but looking at the 3 strangers who had invaded her peaceful morning, she realized that some things never really changed. The strong still tried to take from the weak, and those who wanted to keep what was theirs had to be ready to fight for it. The silence stretched between Rebecca and the three men like a wire pulled too tight. She could feel sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool morning air. The Winchester felt heavy in her hands, but she kept it steady, aimed directly at the older man, who seemed to be enjoying this situation far too much. 10 seconds, she repeated, her voice carrying across the yard. The tall man held up his hands in what looked like a peaceful gesture, but his eyes never stopped calculating. Now hold on there, ma'am. Nobody needs to get excited here. We're all reasonable people. 9, Rebecca counted down. The shorter, nervous man took a step backward toward the truck. His eyes kept darting between Rebecca's rifle and his companion's, like he was starting to realize this wasn't going as planned. 8. Lady, you're making a big mistake, the older man said, but he had stopped laughing. For the first time since they'd arrived, he looked like he was taking her seriously. 7. Rebecca's grandfather had taught her that the key to winning any confrontation was to mean what you said. If you made a threat, you had to be prepared to follow through. Otherwise, people would walk all over you for the rest of your life. 6. The tall man started walking slowly toward the house, his hands still raised. Let's just talk about this. We don't want any trouble. 5. Stop right there or I'll shoot. He froze in place, finally understanding that she wasn't bluffing. The friendly mask had completely fallen away now, and she could see the cold calculation in his eyes. 4. Okay, the nervous man said quickly. Maybe we should just go, find another place to look. The older man shot him a look that could have melted steel. Shut up, Tommy. 3. Rebecca knew she had to make a decision. Either these men were going to leave or this situation was about to get a lot worse. She could see the older man's hand moving slowly toward his jacket, and every instinct she had was screaming danger. 2. Last chance, she called out instead of backing down. The tall man suddenly dove to his left, rolling behind an old water trough near the driveway. At the same moment, the older man's hand disappeared into his jacket. Rebecca didn't hesitate. She squeezed the trigger, and the Winchester's boom echoed across the valley like thunder. The shot went high and to the right, exactly where she'd aimed it. She wasn't trying to hit anyone, just show them she was serious. The bullet slammed into a fence post about 20 feet from where the men stood, sending splinters flying. The sound was loud enough to make all three men duck for cover. Next one won't be a warning shot, Rebecca yelled, working the bolt to chamber another round. The nervous man was already running back toward the truck, but the tall man was shouting. Orders from behind the water trough. She can't watch all of us at once. Circle around the back. Rebecca's heart sank. She'd known this would happen. From her position on the porch, she could cover the front yard, but the house had too many blind spots. If they split up and came at her from different directions, she'd be in serious trouble. She fired another shot, this one aimed at the ground near the older man's feet. Dirt exploded upward, and he scrambled away from the spot, cursing loudly. I called the sheriff, she lied, hoping to buy herself some time. He'll be here any minute. No, you didn't, the tall man called back. We know there's no phone service out here, and your cell phone won't work either. They had done their homework. Rebecca realized these men had planned this carefully, choosing their target because of how isolated and vulnerable it was. She heard the sound of boots on gravel and saw the nervous man trying to work his way around the side of the house. She swung the rifle toward him and fired another shot into the air. He dove behind an old chicken coop, but she knew he'd keep moving as soon as she looked away. The problem was becoming clear. She had maybe a dozen shells for the rifle, and she was already down to 9. If she kept firing warning shots, she'd run out of ammunition long before these men gave up. Rebecca made a quick decision. She couldn't defend the house from multiple directions, but she knew every inch of this property. If she could get to the hills behind the ranch, she might be able to use the terrain to her advantage. She backed through the front door, keeping the rifle pointed toward the yard. Inside the house, she grabbed a box of ammunition from the closet and stuffed it into her jacket pocket. She also took a canteen of water and her grandfather's old field knife. Through the back window, she could see the older man trying to sneak around behind the barn. In a few minutes, they'd have the house surrounded. And then she'd be trapped. Rebecca slipped out the back door and ran toward the tree line about 100 yards away. Behind her, she heard shouting as the men realized she was no longer in the house. "She's running," someone yelled. "Don't let her get to the hills." Rebecca's boots pounded against the hard ground as she sprinted toward the safety of the trees. She could hear the men crashing through the brush behind her, but she had a head start and she knew exactly where she was going. The hills behind the ranch were crisscrossed with old deer trails and hidden ravines. She'd spent her childhood exploring every canyon and ridge, learning the land the way city kids learned street names. If she could get there, she'd have a fighting chance. A gunshot rang out behind her, and she heard the bullet whistle past her head. They were shooting to kill now, not just trying to scare her. The friendly researchers had dropped all pretense and shown their true colors. Rebecca reached the tree line and dove behind a large boulder just as another shot rang out. Bark exploded from a pine tree inches from her head. These men weren't just treasure hunters or casual criminals. They knew how to handle weapons, and they weren't afraid to use them. She worked her way deeper into the trees, using every bit of cover she could find. The canopy overhead filtered the sunlight into patches of light and shadow, making it harder for her pursuers to get a clear shot. Behind her, she could hear them arguing about which direction she'd gone. They were city people, not used to reading tracks or following trails through rough country. That gave her an advantage, but only if she used it wisely. Rebecca found a game trail that led up toward a series of rocky outcroppings about half a mile above the ranch. From there, she'd be able to see the entire valley and watch for Tom's return. More importantly, the rocks would give her cover and make it almost impossible for the three men to surround her as she climbed. Her mind raced through everything she knew about survival in hostile territory. Her grandfather had been in the military during the Korean War, and he'd taught her that the key to staying alive was to think like a soldier, not a victim. She had advantages these men didn't know about. She knew where the hidden springs were. If she needed water, she knew which trails led to dead ends and which ones connected to the main road. Most importantly, she knew that Tom would realize something was wrong when he came back and found the house empty, but that was still hours away. Until then, she was on her own. Rebecca reached the rocky outcropping and found a position where she could watch the trails below. The three men had split up and were trying to follow her, but they were making too much noise and moving too slowly. She settled in behind a large rock and checked her rifle. 8 rounds left in the magazine, plus the full box in her pocket. Enough to make anyone think twice about getting too close. The real question was whether she could hold them off long enough for help to arrive, or whether she'd have to do something more drastic to survive. Rebecca crouched behind the granite boulder, her breathing finally starting to slow down after the desperate sprint up the hillside. From her position in the rocks, she could see the entire ranch spread out below her like a miniature model. The house looked tiny from this distance, and she could just make out the three men's truck still parked by the front gate. The climb had taken almost 20 minutes, and she'd gained maybe 300 feet in elevation. Not much by mountain standards, but enough to give her a clear view of anyone trying to follow her trail. More importantly, the rocky terrain up here would make it almost impossible for the men to approach without being seen. She wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand and checked her rifle again. The familiar weight of the Winchester gave her some comfort, but she knew she had to be smart about how she used it. Every shot had to count now. Through the trees below, she could hear the men crashing through the underbrush. They were making enough noise to wake the dead, clearly not used to moving quietly through rough country. City people, she thought, probably never spent a day in the wilderness in their lives. The tall man's voice carried up through the trees, angry and frustrated. She can't have gone far. Spread out and find her trail. Rebecca smiled grimly. Let them try. The hillside was covered with loose rocks and thick pine needles that wouldn't hold footprints. Even experienced trackers would have trouble following her route, and these men were clearly amateurs when it came to wilderness skills. She settled into a more comfortable position and began scanning the slopes below with the careful attention her grandfather had taught her. Movement was what gave people away in country like this. A flash of color that didn't belong, the unnatural motion of someone trying to move quickly through dense cover, there, about 200 yards down the slope. She caught sight of the nervous man picking his way carefully through a stand of aspen trees. He kept looking over his shoulder, obviously uncomfortable with being separated from his companions. Good, scared people. Made mistakes. Rebecca tracked his movement with the rifle, but didn't fire. She was too far away for an accurate shot, and she needed to conserve ammunition. More importantly, she wanted to see where all three men were before she revealed her position. A few minutes later, she spotted the older man working his way up a different trail about a quarter mile to her left. He was moving more confidently than his nervous companion, but he was still making the classic mistake of following the easiest path. Instead of thinking about where those paths might lead, the tall man was harder to spot. He seemed to have better instincts than the others, staying under cover and moving more carefully. Rebecca finally caught sight of him when he paused at the edge of a small clearing. Studying the ground for signs of her passage, all three men were now spread across almost half a mile of mountainside, each following a different route up toward her position. It was exactly what she'd hoped for. Divided, they were much less dangerous than they would be working together. Rebecca checked her watch. It was still only mid-morning, which meant Tom wouldn't be back for at least 8 hours. She needed to find a way to either drive these men off completely or delay them long enough for help to arrive. The nervous man was getting closer, maybe 150 yards away now. He'd found what looked like a game trail and was following it up through the rocks. What he didn't know was that the trail led to a dead end where a flash flood had carved out. A steep-sided ravine years ago. Rebecca had played in that ravine as a child, and she knew every inch of it. More importantly, she knew that anyone who followed the trail would be trapped at the bottom with only one way out. She made her decision quickly. Instead of waiting for the man to reach her position, she would go to him. Moving carefully from rock to rock, she began working her way down the slope at an angle that would bring her above the ravine. The descent was tricky. The rocks were loose in places, and any noise would give away her position. But Rebecca had spent years learning to move quietly through this country, first while hunting with her grandfather and later while tracking wounded cattle through the hills. 20 minutes later, she was in position above the narrow ravine. The nervous man was still following the trail, completely unaware that he was walking into a natural trap. Rebecca could hear him breathing hard from the climb and occasionally muttering to himself about city people not being meant for this kind of work. When he reached the edge of the ravine, he stopped and looked down at the steep drop. Rebecca could see the confusion on his face as he realized the trail didn't continue on the other side. "End of the line," she called out softly. The man spun around, his eyes wide with panic as he tried to locate the source of her voice. Rebecca was positioned among the rocks about 30 feet above him, effectively invisible unless someone knew exactly where to look. "Drop your weapon and climb back down the way you came," she continued, keeping her voice calm and steady. I can't see you," the man stammered, his hand moving toward the gun tucked in his belt. "Don't," Rebecca warned. "I've got a clear shot, and you've got nowhere to run. Just do what I told you, and nobody gets hurt." The man's hand froze halfway to his weapon. He was sweating heavily now, not just from the climb, but from fear. This wasn't what he'd signed up for when he'd agreed to help search some old ranch for buried treasure. "Look, lady," he said, his voice shaking. "This wasn't my idea. The other guys, they said it would be easy. Nobody was supposed to get hurt. Then why are you carrying a gun?" Rebecca asked. "Just for protection. We heard there might be... Look, I don't even know what we're supposed to be looking for. They just told me to come along and help search." Rebecca studied the man carefully. He seemed genuinely frightened and confused, not like the cold calculations she'd seen in his companions. Maybe he really was just along for the ride, not understanding what kind of people he'd gotten involved with. "What's your name?" she asked. Billy Morrison. "I'm from Denver. I met these guys at a bar, and they said they needed help with some kind of research project." "Billy, those men aren't researchers. They're criminals, and they're going to get you killed if you stay with them." The young man looked around the ravine desperately, finally beginning to understand how much trouble he was in. What am I supposed to do? I can't just leave them here? Yes, you can. Take their truck and drive back to town. Tell the sheriff what's happening out here? Billy shook his head. You don't understand. The older guy, Creed, he's not someone you cross. If I run out on them, he'll come after me. Rebecca felt a chill run down her spine. She'd suspected these men were more than casual criminals, but hearing the fear in Billy's voice confirmed her worst suspicions. This Creed person was dangerous enough to scare someone into following him into what was obviously a bad situation. Billy, listen to me carefully, she said. Whatever Creed told you about this place, whatever he promised you, it's not worth dying for. And that's where this is heading if you don't get out now. Before Billy could respond, the sound of gunfire echoed across the hills. 3 quick shots from somewhere higher up the slope, followed by shouting voices. Rebecca's blood ran cold. The shots had come from the direction of her original position in the rocks. Either one of the other men had found her hiding spot, or they were shooting at shadows, trying to flush her out. That's Creed, Billy said, his face going pale. He's not happy about something. More shots rang out, and Rebecca realized her situation had just gotten much worse. While she'd been dealing with Billy, the other 2 men had been closing in on her position. Now they knew roughly where she was, and they were trying to drive her into the open. Billy, I'm going to give you one chance, she said urgently. Climb out of that ravine and start walking back toward the ranch. Don't look back. Don't try to help your friends. Just get out of here. The young man looked torn between fear of Rebecca's rifle and fear of what Creed would do to him if he abandoned. Then another volley of shots echoed through the hills, closer this time. Rebecca could hear the tall man shouting orders, organizing some kind of coordinated search. They were hunting her now, and she was running out of time to maintain her advantage? Go, she told Billy firmly, before this gets any worse. Rebecca began working her way back up the slope, moving from cover to cover as quickly as she dared. The game of cat and mouse was about to become much more deadly. Rebecca moved quickly through the rocks, keeping low and using every bit of cover she could find. The gunshots from above had stopped, but she could still hear voices calling back and forth between the 2 remaining men. They were trying to coordinate their search, and that made them much more dangerous than when they'd been wandering around separately. She paused behind a fallen log to catch her breath and assess her situation. Billy was hopefully heading back down the mountain, but Creed and the tall man were still hunting her. From the sound of their voices, they seemed to be working their way along the ridgeline, trying to cut off her escape routes. Rebecca knew these hills better than anyone, but she also knew that 2 determined men with weapons could cover a lot of ground if they worked together. She needed to do something to even the odds, and she needed to do it soon. The canyon system started about half a mile higher up the slope. It was a maze of narrow passages and hidden chambers carved into the rock by thousands of years of water flow. During spring runoff, the canyons could be dangerous, but this late in the season they were mostly dry except for a few deep pools. More importantly, the canyons had acoustic properties that could work to her advantage. Sound bounced off the walls in strange ways, making it almost impossible to tell where voices were coming from. If she could get the 2 men to follow her into that maze, she might be able to turn the tables on them. Rebecca began moving uphill again, deliberately making more noise than she had before. She wanted them to know which direction she was heading. Every few minutes she would pause and let a small rock tumble down the slope, or snap a dry branch under her boot. Sure enough, she soon heard the men changing direction to follow her trail. They were being more careful now, moving quietly and checking their surroundings. But they were still coming after her. The entrance to the canyon system was marked by 2 tall pillars of red sandstone that stood like sentinels against the sky. Rebecca had played here as a child, exploring every twist and turn of the narrow passages. She knew which routes led to dead ends and which ones connected to other parts of the mountain as she slipped between the stone pillars. Rebecca felt a familiar sense of coming home. This was her territory now, a place where her knowledge of every crack and crevice would give her an overwhelming advantage. The main canyon was about 20 feet wide and maybe 40 feet deep, with steep walls that rose straight up on both sides. The floor was covered with smooth rocks worn down by centuries of flowing water. Side passages branched off in several directions, creating a natural labyrinth that could confuse anyone who didn't know the layout. Rebecca made her way to a spot about 100 yards into the canyon where she knew the acoustics were particularly tricky. Then she found a hiding place among some large boulders and settled in to wait. She didn't have to wait long. Within 10 minutes, she heard the sound of boots on stone as the two men entered the canyon. Their voices echoed off the walls, making them sound like they were coming from several different directions at once. "She came this way," the tall man was saying. "Look at those scuff marks on the rocks." "I don't like this," Creed's gravelly voice replied. "Too many places for an ambush. Maybe we should go back and wait for her at the ranch." "She's not going back to the ranch. She's running scared, trying to get as far away from us as possible." Rebecca smiled to herself. The tall man was wrong about her motivation, but his mistake might work to her advantage. If he thought she was simply fleeing in panic, he wouldn't be expecting her to fight back. She waited until their voices indicated they were directly below her position, then picked up a small stone and threw it toward one of the side passages. The rock clattered against the canyon wall, creating an echo that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Both men stopped talking immediately. Rebecca could hear them trying to pinpoint the source of the sound, their boots scraping against the stone as they turned in different directions. "There," the tall man whispered. "That side canyon on the right. You sure?" "Has to be. Come on." Rebecca watched through a gap in the rocks as the two men moved toward the passage she'd indicated. It was one of the routes she knew led to a dead end, a narrow crack in the rock that went back about 50 feet before stopping at a solid wall. Once they disappeared into the side passage, Rebecca began moving again. She worked her way along a ledge that ran about 10 feet up the canyon wall, a route that would take her behind the men's position. Her grandfather had shown her this path when she was 8 years old, teaching her how to move like a mountain goat across the narrow shelf of rock. The ledge brought her to a spot directly above the entrance to the dead-end passage. She could hear the men below, their voices frustrated as they realized they'd been led into a trap. "Nothing here," Creed was saying. "Just solid rock?" "Then where did she go?" "Back the way we came." "She's playing games with us." Rebecca picked up a larger rock about the size of a baseball and hefted it in her hand. The walls of the canyon were steep and unstable in places, with loose stones balanced precariously on narrow ledges. If she could start a small rock slide in the right spot, she might be able to block the entrance to the passage and trap both men inside. She found a promising spot, where several large rocks were held in place by smaller stones. Carefully, she began working the supporting stones loose. It was delicate work, too much force, and the whole thing would come down at once, possibly hurting someone seriously. Too little, and nothing would happen. The sound of boots on stone told her the men were heading back out of the dead-end passage. Rebecca worked faster, pulling away the last of the supporting stones, just as the tall man's head appeared at the entrance below. The rock slide wasn't dramatic, just a steady stream of stones and gravel that tumbled down the canyon wall and piled up in front of the passage opening. But it was enough to block the entrance and trap both men inside. "What the hell?" Creed's voice was muffled by the rock barrier, but Rebecca could hear the anger and frustration in it. "She brought the whole damn wall down on us," the tall man replied. Rebecca called out from her position on the ledge, her voice echoing strangely in the enclosed space. "You gentlemen having some trouble down there?" More cursing from below followed, by the sound of men trying to move rocks with their bare hands. "This is what happens when city people come into country they don't understand," Rebecca continued. "You're not in control here anymore." "Lady, when we get out of here, you're going to regret this," Creed shouted back. "You're not getting out," Rebecca replied calmly. "Not unless I let you out. And right now, I don't see any reason to do that." She could hear them working frantically to clear the rock slide, but the stones were too heavy to move quickly by hand. It would take them hours. to dig their way out, assuming they could do it at all. "What do you want?" the tall man called out. "I want you to leave my property and never come back. I want you to stop threatening me and my family. And I want to know who sent you here." Silence from below. Then Creed's voice, more controlled now. "Nobody sent us. We came on our own." "I don't believe you. Men like you don't just decide to rob isolated ranches without someone pointing them in the right direction." More silence. Rebecca knew they were trying to figure out how much she knew and how much she was guessing. "Even if someone did tell us about this place," the tall man finally said, "what difference does it make? You're still stuck up there, and we're not the only ones who know about what's hidden on your land." Rebecca felt a chill run down her spine. The implication was clear. There were other people involved in this, people who might come looking if these three didn't return, but that was a problem for later. Right now, she had two dangerous men trapped and unable to threaten her. For the first time since this morning, she felt like she had some control over the situation. The question was what to do with that control. She could keep them trapped until Tom returned, but that was still hours away. Or she could try to negotiate some kind of agreement that would get them off her land permanently. Either way, she was no longer the hunted. In these ancient canyons that had sheltered her family for generations, she had become the hunter. Rebecca sat on the ledge above the trapped men, listening to them argue with each other through the pile of rocks. The sun was climbing higher in the sky, and she could feel the temperature starting to rise in the enclosed canyon. Down in that narrow passage, it would be getting hot and stuffy pretty quickly. "This is your fault," Creed was saying to his companion. "I told you we should have waited at the ranch. How was I supposed to know she'd lead us into a trap? She's just some ranch woman." "Just some ranch woman who's got us pinned down like amateurs," Creed shot back. "Real smart thinking, following her up here." Rebecca almost smiled. Nothing like a little stress to make partners turn on each other. But her satisfaction was short-lived when she heard a new sound echoing through the canyon system. The distant rumble of an engine. Her heart sank. Someone else was coming up the mountain road. And it wasn't Tom. His truck had a distinctive sound she would have recognized immediately. This engine was different, heavier, like a larger vehicle climbing the steep grade. The trapped men heard it too, and their arguing stopped immediately. "That'll be Jackson," Creed called out, his voice suddenly more confident. "You hear that, lady? The cavalry's coming." Rebecca felt the advantage she'd gained start slipping away. She'd assumed these three men were working alone, but apparently they had backup. Or maybe Jackson was their boss, the one who'd sent them to search her property in the first place. The engine sound was getting closer, winding its way up the mountain road toward the ranch. Rebecca estimated she had maybe 10 minutes before whoever it was reached the house and started looking for the others. "Jackson's not going to be happy when he finds out what happened here," the tall man added. "He doesn't like complications. Who is Jackson?" Rebecca called down to them. Silence from below. Then Creed laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Jackson's the kind of man who finishes what he starts. You thought dealing with us was hard? Wait until you meet him." Rebecca's mind raced through her options. She could stay here and try to maintain her position, but if this Jackson person was as dangerous as Creed suggested, she might find herself facing someone much more competent than the men she'd been dealing with so far, or she could abandon her advantage and try to get back to the ranch before Jackson arrived. But that would mean leaving Creed and the tall man free to dig themselves out and rejoin the fight. The engine sound was definitely getting closer now. Through the canyon entrance, Rebecca could see a dust cloud rising from the road far below. Whatever vehicle was climbing toward the ranch, it was moving fast. She made her decision quickly. Better to face one unknown threat than multiple known ones. Rebecca began working her way back along the ledge, moving as quickly as she dared on the narrow shelf of rock. Behind her, she could hear the trapped men redoubling their efforts to clear the rockslide. Probably motivated by the knowledge that help was on the way, the path down from the canyon system was steep and treacherous, but Rebecca had climbed it hundreds of times over the years. She half ran, half slid down the loose scree slopes, using her rifle as a balance pole to keep from falling. By the time she reached the tree line above the ranch, she could see the new vehicle clearly. It was a black SUV with tinted windows. The kind of car that screamed government or serious money. Definitely not what she'd expected from a group of treasure hunters. The SUV pulled up next to the other truck at the front gate, and a single man got out. Even from a distance, Rebecca could tell this was someone completely different from the three she'd been dealing with. He moved with confidence and purpose, scanning the ranch buildings and surrounding hills with the systematic attention of someone trained in security or military work. Jackson, she assumed. And Creed had been right. He looked like the kind of man who finished what he started. Rebecca found a position among the trees where she could watch the ranch house while staying hidden. She needed to understand what she was dealing with before making any moves. Jackson walked around the property for several minutes, clearly reading the signs of what had happened. He examined the bullet holes in the fence post, followed the tracks leading toward the hills, and checked the abandoned house thoroughly. Then he pulled out a cell phone and made a call. Rebecca was too far away to hear what he was saying, but his body language suggested he wasn't pleased with the situation he'd found after ending the call. Jackson went back to his SUV and retrieved something from the back. Rebecca's blood ran cold when she saw what it was: a high-powered rifle with a scope. The kind of weapon used by serious hunters or military snipers. This was no treasure hunter or small-time criminal. This was a professional, and he'd come prepared for a very different kind of confrontation than what his men had stumbled into. Jackson began walking toward the hills, following the obvious trail left by the earlier chase. He moved carefully but confidently, like someone who'd tracked people through rough country before. Rebecca realized she had maybe 20 minutes before he reached the canyon system and found his trapped associates. Once that happened, she'd be facing 3 armed men plus someone who actually knew what he was doing. The smart thing would be to run. Get as far away from the ranch as possible and wait for Tom to come home and find the mess. Let him call the sheriff and deal with whatever these people wanted, but Rebecca couldn't bring herself to abandon the land her family had worked for 3 generations. More than that, something about Jackson's professional demeanor and expensive equipment told her this wasn't going to end just because she ran away. These people wanted something specific from her property, and they weren't going to give up until they got it. She started moving down the hillside, angling to intercept Jackson before he reached the canyons. If she was going to make a stand, it would be on ground of her choosing, not trapped in the maze of rock passages where his superior equipment and training would give him every advantage. Rebecca found a spot where the trail passed through a narrow gap between 2 large boulders. It was a natural choke point where anyone coming up from the ranch would have to pass within 50 yards of her position. She checked her rifle one more time. 6 rounds left in the magazine, plus the full box of shells in her pocket. Not much against a professional with a scoped rifle, but it would have to do. The waiting was the hardest part. Rebecca could hear Jackson making his way up the trail, moving much more quietly than his associates had. He paused frequently, probably scanning the surrounding area for signs of ambush. Smart man. Too smart for her comfort. When Jackson finally appeared at the far end of the gap, Rebecca had to fight the urge to shoot immediately. He was moving carefully, his rifle ready, eyes constantly scanning the rocks and trees around him, but something made her hesitate. Maybe it was the professional way he carried himself, or maybe it was the growing certainty that shooting him wouldn't solve her problems. There were too many unknowns, too many questions about who these people were and what they really wanted. Instead of firing, Rebecca called out from her concealed position. "That's far enough." Jackson froze immediately, but he didn't panic like the others had. Instead, he began a slow, careful scan of the area, trying to locate her position. "You must be the lady of the house," he said calmly. "My associates seem to have gotten themselves into some trouble. Your associates threatened me with weapons on my own property." "They're lucky I didn't shoot them," Jackson nodded slowly. "Yes, I can see they handled this badly." "That's unfortunate. Who are you? What do you want here?" "My name is Jackson, and I represent certain interests that believe your property contains something of value." "We'd like to discuss a business arrangement," Rebecca almost laughed. A business arrangement? After your men tried to rob me? Those men exceeded their authority. I apologize for their unprofessional behavior. The conversation felt surreal. Here she was, hiding behind rocks with a rifle, talking to a man who spoke like he was conducting a board meeting. Get off my land, Rebecca said firmly. Take your men and leave. Jackson was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had changed slightly, becoming harder and more direct. I'm afraid that's not possible. We've come too far and invested too much to walk away empty-handed. But I'm willing to make you a fair offer for what we need. And if I refuse? Another pause, then we'll have to explore other options. Rebecca felt a chill run down her spine. The polite businessman mask was slipping, revealing something much more dangerous underneath. The standoff between Rebecca and Jackson stretched on for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Neither of them moved, each waiting for the other to make the first mistake. Rebecca's hands were starting to cramp from gripping the rifle so tightly, but she didn't dare relax her guard. You know, Jackson said conversationally, this doesn't have to be difficult. What we're looking for won't interfere with your ranching operation. You could go on living here exactly as you? Always have. Except with you people coming and going whenever you feel like it, Rebecca replied. No, thank you. The compensation would be substantial. Enough to pay off your mortgage and modernize this entire operation. Rebecca felt a chill. Jackson knew about their finances, which meant these people had been researching her family for much longer than she'd realized. How do you know about our mortgage? We know quite a bit about you and your husband, Mrs. Patterson. We know he works long hours, trying to keep this ranch profitable. We know you inherited it from your grandfather 2 years ago, along with significant debt. We know you've been struggling to make ends meet. The casual way he recited personal details about her life made Rebecca's skin crawl. These weren't random treasure hunters who'd gotten lucky with local gossip. This was organized, professional, and had been planned for a long time. What exactly do you think is hidden on my property? She asked. Jackson shifted his position slightly, and Rebecca caught a glimpse of his scoped rifle. Even with her limited knowledge of firearms, she could tell it was expensive and military grade. Your great-grandfather was more than just a supplier? To local mining operations, Jackson said. He was a middleman for certain transactions that weren't entirely legal at the time. Some of those transactions involved items that have become quite valuable over the decades. You're talking about stolen goods? I'm talking about historical artifacts that have been misplaced for nearly a century. Items that belong in museums or private collections, not buried in the ground where they benefit no one. Rebecca almost laughed at the absurdity of it. So, you're here to rescue lost artifacts? How noble of you. Mock me if you want, but the reality is simple. We have evidence that items worth millions of dollars are hidden somewhere on this property. We're going to find them, with or without your cooperation. The conversation was interrupted by a distant rumbling sound that made Rebecca's heart leap with relief. It was Tom's truck, still far down the mountain, but definitely heading home. She recognized the sound of the engine struggling up the steep grades. The familiar rhythm of her husband's driving. Jackson heard it too. His posture changed immediately, becoming more alert and focused. Your husband, I assume? He said. Rebecca didn't answer, but she could see Jackson calculating new factors in his head. The arrival of another person would complicate his plans, especially if that person was armed and knew the terrain as well as Rebecca did. You should call out to him, Jackson continued. Tell him to stay away from the house. This doesn't have to involve him. Everything that happens on this ranch involves him, Rebecca said firmly. The sound of Tom's truck was getting closer, maybe 5 minutes away from the ranch house. Rebecca knew her husband's routine well enough to predict his next moves. He'd drive straight to the barn to unload his gear, then come to the house looking for her. When he found signs of the struggle and her missing, Tom would grab his own rifle and come looking. He knew these hills almost as well as she did, and he was a better shot than most people realized. Mrs. Patterson, Jackson said, his voice taking on a harder edge, I strongly advise you to contact your husband and tell him to turn around. If he comes up here, people are going to get hurt. He's not going to turn around. This is his home. Jackson seemed to consider this, then made a decision. He began backing away from the gap between the rocks, moving toward a position where he'd have a clear view of both the trail and the ranch below. Then we'll have to adjust our approach, he said. Rebecca felt panic rising in her chest. Jackson was repositioning himself to use Tom as leverage against her. From his new position, he'd be able to threaten her husband while still keeping her pinned down. She had to do something before. Tom arrived and walked into a trap. Rebecca made her decision quickly. Instead of staying hidden, she burst from cover and sprinted toward a cluster of boulders about 30 yards closer to Jackson's position. It was a risky move that would put her in the open for several seconds, but it would also force Jackson to react instead of setting up his own ambush. The professional responded exactly as she'd expected. His rifle swung toward her moving figure, but he held his fire, probably hoping to take her alive rather than dead. Rebecca dove behind the rocks just as Jackson's voice rang out across the hillside. "Stop right there, or I'll put a bullet in your leg." "Try it," Rebecca called back. Chambering a fresh round, she could hear Tom's truck pulling into the ranch yard far below. The engine shut off, and she knew her husband was now walking into a situation he couldn't possibly understand. From her new position, Rebecca had a better angle on Jackson's location. She could see him crouched behind a fallen tree, his rifle trained on the gap she'd just left. He was good, but he'd made the mistake of assuming she'd stay put like an amateur. "Your husband just arrived," Jackson called out. "I can see him from here. Right now, he's walking toward the house, completely unaware of what's happening up here." Rebecca's heart clenched, but she forced herself to stay focused. Jackson was trying to rattle her, make her do something stupid. "He's stopping at the front door," Jackson continued, "looking at the bullet holes in the fence post. Now he's going inside the house." Rebecca knew Tom would find the signs of struggle immediately. The overturned chair, the open gun cabinet, the missing rifle. He'd understand what had happened and react accordingly. Sure enough, within minutes she heard the distant slam of the kitchen door and saw Tom emerge from the house carrying his hunting rifle. Even from this distance, she could tell from his body language that he was angry and worried. Tom walked to his truck and grabbed something from the cab. Binoculars, Rebecca realized. He was going to scan the hills looking for her. "Smart man," Jackson said admiringly. "He's not panicking." "That's good. Panic gets people killed." Through the binoculars, Tom would be able to see the trail of disturbed ground and broken vegetation that marked the chase route. He'd follow it up into the hills, and then he'd be walking into exactly the kind of trap Jackson wanted. Rebecca had to warn him somehow, but she also couldn't give away her position. Jackson was too good a shot to take chances with. Then she remembered something her grandfather had taught her about communication in the wilderness. Sound carried differently at different times of day, and the wind patterns in these hills were predictable. Rebecca cupped her hands around her mouth and let out a long, warbling call that sounded almost like a bird. It was a signal she and Tom had used when hunting together, a way to communicate location without using words that might spook game. The call echoed across the valley, and she saw Tom's head snap up in response. He knew that sound, and he knew it meant danger. Tom lowered the binoculars and began moving more carefully, using cover as he started up the trail. He'd gotten the message. "Clever," Jackson said, "but it won't help him. I've got the high ground and better equipment." Rebecca was starting to understand that Jackson's biggest weakness was his confidence. He was so used to having every advantage that he didn't know how to adapt when things didn't go according to plan. "You know what your problem is?" Rebecca called out. "I'm sure you're going to tell me. You think this is about equipment and training, but you're fighting for money." "We're fighting for our home." Jackson didn't respond immediately, and Rebecca wondered if her words had hit home. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, almost thoughtful. "Money, family, legacy, home, it's all just different words for the same thing. Mrs. Patterson, things people are willing to die for." Rebecca felt the weight of those words. Jackson wasn't just threatening them. He was telling her exactly how far he was prepared to go. In the distance, She could see Tom working his way up the trail, moving from cover to cover with the patience of someone who understood he was walking into a dangerous situation. The final confrontation was about to begin. Tom moved through the forest with the careful precision of someone who'd spent his entire life reading tracks and following trails. Rebecca watched him through gaps in the rocks, her heart swelling with pride and terror at the same time. He was doing everything right, staying low, using cover, but she knew Jackson had him in his sights. The professional had repositioned himself on a rocky outcrop that gave him a commanding view of both Rebecca's hiding spot and the trail Tom was following. It was a perfect tactical position, and Rebecca realized that all of Jackson's polite conversation had been a distraction while he maneuvered into place. "Your husband's about 200 yards out," Jackson called to her. "At his current pace, he'll reach my position in about 10 minutes. I'd like to resolve this before then." Rebecca could see Tom pause behind a large pine tree, probably trying to figure out where the voices were coming from. The echoing quality of sound in these hills made it almost impossible to pinpoint exact locations, which was both an advantage and a problem. "What's your final offer?" Rebecca asked, buying time while she tried to think of a way to warn Tom about Jackson's position. "Simple. You tell us where your great-grandfather hid the artifacts, we retrieve them, and everyone walks away with their fair share. You get enough money to pay off all your debts and modernize this ranch. We get what we came for." "And if I don't know where anything is hidden?" Jackson's laugh had no warmth in it. "Mrs. Patterson, we know your grandfather left you more than just this ranch. He left you information. Letters, documents, maybe even a map. We've seen the safety deposit box records." Rebecca's blood ran cold. They'd been investigating her family's private affairs for months, maybe years. The safety deposit box did contain some of her grandfather's old papers, but she'd never paid much attention to them. Just old bills, land surveys, and faded photographs. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but even as she spoke, she was remembering a conversation with her grandfather shortly before he died. He'd mentioned something about family history, about secrets that went back to the old mining days. She'd assumed it was just the rambling of an old man. "Check your grandfather's papers again," Jackson said. "Look for references to the Copper Creek Mining Company. That's where this all started." Tom had moved closer, maybe 150 yards away now. Rebecca could see him scanning the rocks above, trying to locate the source of the conversation. She needed to do something before he walked into Jackson's line of fire. Rebecca made her decision. She began working her way around the edge of her rocky shelter, trying to get to a position where she could see Jackson more clearly. If she could get a clean shot, she might be able to end this without Tom getting involved, but Jackson was too experienced to let her outflank him. As soon as she moved, his rifle swung toward her new position. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," he said calmly. "Stay where you are and nobody gets hurt." That's when Rebecca heard the sound that changed everything, distant voices calling from the direction of the canyon system. Creed and the tall man had finally managed to dig themselves out of the rockslide. They were free and they sounded angry. Jackson heard it too, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he looked genuinely concerned. "Well," he said, "that complicates things." The voices were getting closer and Rebecca could make out words. Now, Creed was shouting orders to his companion, telling him to circle around and cut off any escape routes. They were coordinating a search pattern, and they had revenge on their minds. "Jackson!" Creed's voice echoed across the hills. "Where are you? We've got problems up here." Rebecca realized that the situation had just become much more dangerous for everyone involved. Jackson might be a professional, but Creed and the tall man were angry amateurs with weapons. They'd lost face when she'd trapped them, and now they wanted payback. "This wasn't part of the plan," Jackson muttered, and Rebecca caught a note of genuine frustration in his voice. Tom had heard the shouting, too. She could see him change direction, moving toward a position where he'd have a better view of the entire area. He was trying to understand how many people he was dealing with. "Jackson!" Creed called again. "Answer me!" "Here!" Jackson finally responded. "Both of you shut up and get down here. We're trying to negotiate." "Negotiate, hell," came the angry reply. That woman made fools of us. Time for payback. Rebecca felt the situation spiraling out of control. Jackson had been dangerous but predictable, a professional who wanted to complete his mission without unnecessary violence. But Creed and his companion were loose cannons who might start shooting at anything that moved. She had to do something. To protect Tom before he walked into a crossfire between multiple armed groups, Rebecca took a deep breath and made the most difficult decision of her life. She stood up from behind her rocky shelter, the Winchester rifle in her hands, but pointed at the ground. "I'm coming out," she called loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Nobody shoot. Rebecca, no." Tom's voice carried clearly across the hillside. He'd recognized her voice and understood what she was doing. She walked slowly into the open space between the rocks, keeping her movements deliberate and non-threatening. Jackson's rifle tracked her, but he didn't fire. "There she is." Creed's voice was much closer now, maybe 50 yards away through the trees. "I told you we'd find her." Rebecca could see Tom moving toward her position, abandoning his careful approach in favor of speed. He knew she was in immediate danger, and he was coming to help regardless of the risk to himself. "Tom, stay back," she shouted, but it was too late. Tom broke from cover and began running toward her, his rifle ready but not aimed at any specific target. He was focused entirely on reaching his wife, not on the tactical situation around him. That's when everything went wrong at once. Creed appeared at the edge of the tree line, saw Tom running with a weapon, and immediately opened fire. The shots were wild and poorly aimed, but they sent everyone diving for cover. Jackson cursed and swung his rifle toward Creed. "Cease fire, you idiot!" Tom rolled behind a boulder and came up with his rifle raised, trying to identify targets in the chaos. Rebecca found herself caught in the middle of the gunfight, completely exposed with bullets flying in multiple directions. In that moment of pure terror, with her husband in danger and armed men shooting all around her, Rebecca did the only thing that mattered. She looked directly at Tom, who was crouched behind his boulder about 30 yards away, and spoke the words that had been in her heart all day. "Come back to me," she whispered, but somehow he heard her over the noise of the gunfight. Their eyes met across the chaotic battlefield, and everything else faded away. Tom nodded, understanding not just her words but everything they meant. "Come back alive, come back safe. Come back to the life we've built together." The gunfire stopped as suddenly as it had started. Jackson had apparently gotten control of his men, and Tom was holding his position, waiting to see what would happen next. In the sudden silence, Rebecca realized that Jackson was standing up, his rifle lowered. "Enough," he said, his voice carrying complete authority. "This is over." Creed started to protest, but Jackson cut him off with a look that could have stopped a charging bull. "We're leaving," Jackson continued, "all of us, right now." "But the artifacts," the tall man began. "We'll wait for another day," Jackson finished. "This operation has become compromised. We'll regroup and try a different approach." Rebecca couldn't believe what she was hearing. After everything that had happened, Jackson was just going to walk away. "Why?" she asked. Jackson looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Because I've seen how far you and your husband are willing to go to protect each other in this land. That kind of determination, it changes the risk calculation." He gestured to his men, who reluctantly began moving back toward the trail. "This isn't over, Mrs. Patterson," Jackson said as he prepared to leave. "But it's over for today." As the three men disappeared into the forest, Tom emerged from behind his boulder and ran to Rebecca. They held each other tightly, neither one speaking for several minutes. Finally, Tom pulled back and looked into her eyes. "I heard what you said," he whispered. "I meant it. I know, that's why I'm here." They walked back to the ranch house together as the sun began to set over the mountains. There would be phone calls to make, sheriff's reports to file, and difficult decisions about what to do with whatever secrets their family land really held. But for now, they were home, they were safe, and they were together. In the end, that was all that really mattered. Rebecca looked back once at the hills where she'd spent the day fighting for her life and her family's legacy. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, she and Tom would sleep in their own bed, in the house her grandfather had built, On the land that had shaped 3 generations of their family. Come back to me, she thought again and smiled. He had.